The room went dead silent when Elena Martinez walked past, and she preferred it that way. 2 sizes too big, her scrubs hung like borrowed skin, the fabric whispering against itself as she moved through the ER corridors at Mercy General in San Diego. Her eye stayed downcast. Her hand stayed steady. Nobody looked twice at the woman restocking crash carts at 0600 on a Tuesday morning, and that was precisely how she had engineered it. Her teenage son Miguel didn't know. The other nurses didn't know. The doctor certainly didn't know, especially not Dr. Sterling, who was already clicking through the hallway in Italian shoes that cost more than Elena's monthly car payment, his phone pressed to his ear while he negotiated invoice percentages with his brother about medical equipment that never quite worked as advertised. Elena's fingers trembled exactly once, for half a second, as she arranged the defibrillator pads in their tray. Not from fear. From restraint. From the effort of keeping 12 years of muscle memory locked inside a body that was supposed to look fragile, supposed to look like she didn't know how to save a life without asking permission first. She had held the throat of a Taliban commander closed with her bare hands for 11 minutes while waiting for helicopter evacuation. 11 minutes. Her call sign in Helmand Province had been a miracle, not because she was lucky, but because she refused to leave people behind. That was 2009 to 2012. 3 tours. 2 Purple Hearts. A silver star folded in a shadow box at the bottom of her closet, next to a photograph of her best friend Sarah, who didn't make it out of San Juan Valley. Now Elena Martinez pushed a crash cart with a squeaking wheel through linoleum hallways that had been worn thin by 20 years of footsteps, and nobody suspected that the quiet nurse in the oversized scrubs had once been responsible for the medical protocols that saved 214 Marines across multiple deployments. Nobody needed to know. That life was sealed away, buried under a civilian social security number and a fabricated nursing school transcript from a college that actually existed but had never taught her anything she didn't already know. Bay 7 held the new admission. She knew before she was told, the way the air pressure shifted, the way the staff moved around the patient like he was already invisible. Staff Sergeant Chen sat on the examination table, his body language readable as a military manual to anyone trained to read it. Shoulders squared. Eyes tracking movement. Jaw set. He was deaf, the chart made that clear in blue ink, but Elena could see that the deafness wasn't the problem. The problem was what hung on the hook beside his gurney, his jacket, and sewn into the lining with careful stitches, a faded unit patch. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. Elena's breath caught for exactly 1 second. She didn't let it show on her face. That patch was from the same unit where her son Miguel had just joined 3 months ago. The same unit where Chen had served as staff sergeant. The same unit that operated out of Camp Lejeune. Elena had pretended not to notice when Miguel started talking about his commanding officer, a deaf veteran who had earned a reputation for making split-second tactical decisions in hostile environments and never missing a single radio transmission because he relied on visual confirmation and hand signals that his platoon trusted more than spoken words. She had pretended not to hear when Miguel said his name was Chen, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that her hidden world and her real world were on a collision course, and collisions could expose everything. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the patch. 1 touch, and she felt the weight of 12 years pressing down on her shoulders like a barbell across her spine. She didn't ask who had sewn those stitches or whether Chen knew what unit her son was attached to or whether the universe was testing her commitment to staying invisible. She simply pulled her hand back, turned away, and returned to work. The trembling that wanted to come stayed locked inside her chest where it belonged. Dr. Sterling arrived at 06:05, his presence announced by the click-click-click of Italian leather on tile and the agitated cadence of his voice through his phone. "I don't care what the network says, tell him we're allocating the diagnostic equipment through Pinnacle Medical Solutions, and if his practice doesn't want to invoice us directly, he can lose the contract." He was maybe 55, with a kind of tan that came from a tanning bed and the kind of watch that screamed inherited money. A Rolex. Probably $12,000. Probably never once glanced at the cost of a unit patch or a pair of combat boots or the therapy needed to keep a 12-year secret buried deep enough that it didn't surface in nightmares. Sterling glanced toward Bay 7 once, already calculating. Elena could see it happening in real time, the mental math of insurance status, revenue potential, whether this particular patient would generate billable hours. What she watched was a man constructing his refusal before he'd even met the patient. His brother owned a medical equipment company. Sterling funneled diagnostic cases through that company, inflated the invoices, and kicked back percentages. The hospital administration didn't ask questions because Sterling had the kind of reputation that made insurance companies pay his invoices without auditing them. 47 referrals in the last 18 months, all to Pinnacle. $430,000 in equipment charges, most of it unnecessary. A deaf veteran with no insurance was a $400 write-off. "I'll take this one," Sterling said to the charge nurse, not bothering to look at Chen directly. "Get him situated in observation, write up the differential, and I'll review in my office." His presenting with respiratory distress, elevated JVD, tracheal deviation, the charge nurse said, reading from her notes. "Possibly tension pneumothorax. He needs—" "Communication barrier," Sterling interrupted, waving his hand like he was clearing smoke. "Get interpretation services involved. I'm not running a special clinic here. Tell him we need 24 hours for proper documentation before any invasive procedures." Elena knew exactly what that meant. 24 hours for Sterling to confirm that Chen was uninsured. 24 hours for him to build a file of pretexts for refusing treatment. She had seen this pattern unfold 47 times in the 3 years she'd worked at Mercy General. The first time, she had believed it was just incompetence. By the 5th time, she recognized it as strategy. By the 22nd time, she understood that it was systematic. This was how Sterling maintained his financial model, by identifying patients who couldn't sue, couldn't generate revenue, and couldn't complain loudly enough for anyone in administration to care. Sterling walked past Elena while she was replacing supplies in the crash cart, and he made a point of making eye contact just long enough for his expression to shift into something contemptuous. "Make sure that bay gets turned over quickly," he said, his voice pitched so the other nurses could hear. "We have actual patients to prioritize. Some of us are trying to maintain standards here." The message was clear: you're failing. You're wasting resources. You don't belong. Elena had trained herself not to flinch anymore. The trembling stayed buried. She nodded once, her eyes dropping back to her task, and continued arranging the cardiac monitoring leads in their compartment with the precision of someone arranging tactical equipment before a deployment. This was the part she understood: how to make yourself small enough that people couldn't see you, even when you were standing right in front of them. But the faded patch in Bay 7 was still visible from where she stood. 3rd Battalion. Dark Horse. And in that jacket pocket, according to military record, was probably a photograph of the Marines in Chen's platoon. One of those faces would be her son Miguel. One of those Marines would be someone Chen had trained, bled with, trusted with his life. Sterling disappeared into his office, and the ER resumed its morning rhythm. Monitors beeped in their electronic patterns. A stretcher squeaked past on wheels that needed oil. Somewhere down the corridor, the intercom crackled with a code blue announcement, and the floor shifted like a living organism responding to emergency. Elena stood in the center of the activity, hidden in plain sight, and understood that the choices she made in the next 48 hours would either keep her hidden forever or expose everything she had spent 12 years protecting. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she had already decided, the moment she saw that patch, that she wouldn't let Sterling turn away a Marine who had earned the right to invisibility through the same means she had, through sacrifice, through service, through holding the line when nobody else would. That decision meant her own burial was over. She just didn't know it yet. Dr. Sterling's voice cut through Bay 7 like a scalpel. "I don't have time for non-revenue cases." He stood at the foot of Marcus Chen's gurney, the chart snapped shut in his hands, his tone loud enough for the hallway to hear. Chen's elderly parents sat in the plastic chairs beside him, and his daughter, maybe 22, signed frantically in ASL, her hands moving in urgent arcs as she translated her father's deteriorating status into a language Sterling had already dismissed before Elena even arrived. Elena stood in the doorway, her scrub pocket heavy with the weight of a faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining downstairs in her locker, the 3rd Battalion insignia that no one at Mercy General was supposed to know about. She watched Sterling point one finger at her across the bay, his gesture theatrical, practiced. This was performance. This was a man who had orchestrated 20 doctors' refusals over 48 hours and needed the audience to understand that he was the one in control. "Nurse Invisible here," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension, "has been bothering my staff about admitting your son. Tell them why that's not happening. Go ahead. Explain to this family why you think we should waste resources on a non-revenue case." Elena's jaw clenched. She had learned in Helmand Province that silence was sometimes the sharpest weapon, that the most dangerous person in a room was often the one who didn't flinch. But she was a nurse at Mercy General now, not a senior chief petty officer anymore. Not officially. So she answered with professional deference, her voice steady and low. "Sergeant Chen has progressive respiratory distress, diminished breath sounds on the right side, and his oxygen saturation is declining. He requires chest imaging and possible intervention." "What he requires," Sterling interrupted, not even looking at her, "is realistic expectations. Medicaid and no insurance authorization. Do you know what 20 doctors have told him?" "No." 20. "Do you understand what that means, Nurse Invisible? It means there's no medical necessity here. It means this is a waste of hospital resources." He turned back to Chen's parents, his smile practiced and empty. "Your son is stable for discharge. We'll arrange social services." Chen's mother began to cry. Silent tears, the kind that came from a place beyond language, beyond translation. Her hands gripped the edge of her purse. Chen's daughter signed something urgent to her father. Elena caught the gesture for lawyer, caught the fear. And Elena stood there, her hands folded in front of her, not trembling, not burning with rage, not retreating. Just present. Just witnessing. Sterling left the bay without another glance. Elena helped arrange discharge paperwork, her movements efficient and precise, each task a small act of defiance she couldn't quite articulate. By 11:48 a.m., she was standing at the unit board in the nurses' station when Sterling posted his formal write-up. The paper was printed on official hospital letterhead, his signature angular and aggressive at the bottom. Elena Martinez, insubordination. Patient advocacy exceeding scope of practice. Wasting physician time on non-billable admissions. Requires immediate remediation or disciplinary action. The nurses' station fell silent. For RNS at the charting computers looked up, read it, and looked away. Nobody said anything. That was worse than anything they could have said. At lunch, Elena sat alone in the break room with her Tupperware rice and grilled chicken that tasted like cardboard when she put it in her mouth. She had eaten MREs in desert heat that had more flavor than this moment. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like something dying slowly. She unwrapped her sandwich and was raising it to her mouth when four nurses from the cardiac unit gathered their lunch bags from the refrigerator, their movements coordinated and deliberate. They didn't make eye contact. They didn't speak. They simply gathered their things, their message transmitted in pure silence, and walked toward the door. The door clicked shut behind them. Not slammed. Clicked. Controlled. Which somehow made it worse. Elena sat in the empty break room with her sandwich and a single tear that escaped down her left cheek. She didn't wipe it away immediately. She let it fall, let it land on the table in front of her, let herself feel the weight of 20 doctors' refusals, of Sterling's calculated humiliation in front of Chen's family, of the systematic dissolution of her credibility in a single morning. But then she moved. Her right hand came up. She wiped the tear away with the back of her wrist, her eyes never leaving the empty space where the nurses had been standing. And then she spoke. Not to anyone. Not to herself. Just to the room that no longer contained anything but her voice and the hum of the refrigerator. Sergeant Chen earned his silence taking shrapnel meant for my son. I earned mine saving men like him in Helmand. The words hung in the fluorescent air like a confession. Like a threat. Like something that couldn't be unspoken once it had been released into the world. The break room stayed empty. The refrigerator hummed. And somewhere down the hallway, Sterling was reading his own notes about Elena Martinez, passing the break room window at exactly the moment her words were still echoing off the walls he couldn't hear. His eyes narrowed. He had made the calculation in San Diego during his 12 years of building this scheme, the careful orchestration of billing fraud through his brother's medical equipment company, the kickbacks disguised as consulting fees, the systematic denial of charity care to maintain the fiction that Mercy General was a high-revenue facility. He had cultivated relationships with the hospital CFO, the board members who owed him favors, the insurance representatives who benefited from his referrals. He had built a system so intricate that it had survived for hospital audits. But he had not calculated for a nurse who had saved men in Helmand Province. He had not anticipated someone whose past could be investigated, whose background could be scrutinized, whose military connections might surface if anyone decided to look closely at why Elena Martinez was really pushing for admission of an uninsured patient. Sterling went to his office and closed the door. His hands moved across his phone with the precision of someone who understood that threats needed to be neutralized quickly. He called the CFO first, his voice low and urgent. "We have a liability issue with a nurse named Martinez. She's pushing uninsured admissions against my recommendations and I need you to document this in her file. Possible substance abuse issues. I'm building a paper trail." The CFO agreed. Of course he did. They had an arrangement. The second call went to Springfield General, the hospital where Elena had worked 2 years before transferring to San Diego. Sterling disguised his number, used a tone that suggested bureaucratic concern rather than calculated sabotage. "This is Dr. Sterling at Mercy General. We're conducting a reference check on Elena Martinez and there are some irregularities we're concerned about. Possible drug diversion. Inventory discrepancies. I can't say more over the phone, but if you have any documentation, any incidents." He paused, letting the implication settle. The call lasted 90 seconds. He hung up knowing the seed was planted. The third call was to a healthcare consultant he had used before, a man who specialized in chart audits, scope of practice investigations, anything that could be weaponized into termination paperwork. "I need you to audit every patient file for a specific nurse. Look for billing errors, scope of practice violations, anything that suggests incompetence or misconduct. Be thorough. Be detailed. Give me something I can present to HR." Sterling hung up his phone and sat back in his chair. The office was cool and quiet and absolutely certain of its victory. Elena Martinez had just revealed something dangerous, a past, a connection, a depth that didn't match the quiet compliance Sterling had been punishing. And pasts, Sterling understood, could be investigated. Pasts could be exposed. Unless he removed her first. Meanwhile, down in the emergency department, Marcus Chen's oxygen saturation had dropped from 94% to 91 to 88 over the course of Elena's shift. His respiratory rate climbed to 24 breaths per minute, then 26, then 28. His daughter watched the monitors like a prayer, her hand signing questions that no one was answering. Elena checked the admission board, every bed marked occupied, every room held, despite the 3 empty beds on the 4th floor that she could see from the hallway window. The system that Sterling had built was working exactly as designed: deny admission, deny resources, deny a deaf Marine even the basic courtesy of a hospital bed while 20 doctors followed his lead like soldiers following orders. Elena stood at the nurse's station at 3:14 p.m., her hands absolutely still on the counter in front of her. Not trembling. Not shaking from rage or injustice or the weight of what she had just revealed in that break room. Still the way they had been in Helmand Province when she had to choose between protocol and survival, between following orders and saving lives. Her hands were steady because they had been trained to be steady. Her voice, when she approached Sterling in the hallway 3 minutes later, was professional and deferential and perfectly controlled. "His breath sounds are diminishing on the right. He needs a chest tube evaluation." Sterling didn't look up from his tablet. "When I need nursing advice, nurse invisible, I'll ask for it. He's stable enough for discharge planning." Elena nodded and walked away, every muscle in her body screaming to do what she had been trained to do, what her hands remembered how to do. But she was a nurse at Mercy General now, not a senior chief petty officer anymore. Not officially. The clock was ticking. 48 hours was the threshold. And Sterling had no idea that the choice he had made to remove Elena Martinez was about to bring down everything he had built. Dr. Sterling's office door closed with a soft click at 2:14 p.m. on the 47th hour. He sat behind his desk, mahogany the color of old blood, price tag removed years ago, and picked up his phone. His hands were steady. His voice was calm. The calculation was complete. First call of Marcus Webb, the hospital's chief financial officer. Sterling knew Webb owed him 3 favors, minimum. The Sandpiper Golf Club membership Sterling had sponsored. The investment in Webb's brother's real estate venture that had somehow turned profitable despite every indicator suggesting otherwise. The photographs that Sterling had chosen never to mention. Marcus, it's David Sterling. We have a liability issue developing in the emergency department. One of our nursing staff is creating documentation problems, exposing us to regulatory scrutiny. I need her personnel file flagged for audit before this escalates. Sterling paused, letting silence work. I'm thinking gross violation of scope of practice. Something that moves fast. Something that doesn't require board discussion. Webb's response came quickly. Webb always responded quickly when Sterling called. Second call, 2:31 p.m. St. Catherine's Medical Center in Orange County, where Elena Martinez had worked for years ago before she vanished into anonymity at Mercy General. Sterling had already researched this. He had names, protocols, leverage. This is Dr. David Sterling at Mercy General in San Diego. I'm conducting a reference check on Elena Martinez, former staff nurse. We're considering her for a supervisory role and I've encountered some concerns in her current file. Can you speak candidly? Sterling paused as the voice on the other end warmed to the request. Doctors trusted doctors. Hierarchy was its own language. We've noticed some documentation inconsistencies. Medication counts. Nothing proven, you understand. But if she had similar issues with your facility, the implication landed like a stone dropped in still water. Ripple spreading. Third call, 2:36 p.m. Dr. Kenneth Pierce, an outside consultant who specialized in clinical audits, the kind that found problems whether problems existed or not. Sterling had used Pierce 3 times before. Pierce understood the assignment. He understood payment without paperwork. He understood that some audits were less about finding truth than about manufacturing grounds for predetermined conclusions. Ken, I need you at Mercy General by tomorrow morning. Bring 2 associates. I want Elena Martinez's patient files from the last 6 months, every chart, every note, every medication administration record. Look for deviations. Look for gaps. Look for anything that suggests someone was operating outside their licensure. I'll pay double the standard rate. This needs to be fast. This needs to be thorough. This needs to be airtight. Sterling hung up and watched the rain begin against his office window. 48 hours was the threshold. Chen was isolated, uninsured, deaf, dependent. Elena had already shown her weakness, compassion. That compassion, that military past hinted at through careless words, would be weaponized into her destruction. The audit would find something. Audits always found something. By the time anyone questioned the findings, the paperwork would be done, the decision final, Elena's reputation fractured beyond repair. He didn't know that every phone call he made was a thread in a web that would eventually snap. Elena stood at the supply station on the 4th floor, checking medication counts for the afternoon shift, when her phone buzzed. A text from her son Miguel, *, practice early, Mom. Coach wants to drill tackling drills. *. She smiled at the screen, type back, *, be safe. Wear your headgear. *. Miguel was 17 and relentless, a chip off the block, her ex-husband used to say, before the divorce made even those small compliments disappear. At 3:15 p.m., Sterling's consultant arrived. Pierce moved through the hospital like a man collecting evidence at a crime scene. He wore a charcoal suit despite the San Diego heat, and his eyes had the flat quality of someone who had stopped believing in innocence decades ago. He brought 2 associates with laptops. They set up in a small conference room adjacent to medical records. They requested Elena's entire file. They began pulling charts. Elena didn't know they were there. She worked the 4 to midnight shift, and the emergency department was moving with the rhythm of late afternoon, the post-lunch lull before the evening crush. Traumas wouldn't arrive for another few hours. The department had that peculiar quietness that always preceded chaos, like the moment before a thunderstorm when the air pressure changes and every creature knows something is coming but nobody can name it. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen lay in Trauma Bay 3, unmoving except for the rise and fall of his chest on the monitor. 47 hours now. 47 hours of refusal. His daughter sat in the corner chair, scrolling through her phone with the glazed expression of someone who had run through every emotion and arrived at exhaustion. His parents occupied the bench against the far wall, his mother's hand clasped so tightly in his father's that the circulation had probably cut off somewhere around hour 30. At 4:52 p.m., Chen's eyes opened. Elena was restocking the code cart when she heard the movement, the distinctive creak of a hospital gurney as weight shifted, the soft scrape of shoes on linoleum. She didn't look up immediately. She was counting epinephrine vials. 1, 2, 3. But then she heard it, the sound of someone moving with intention. Footsteps. Unsteady. Off the equipment. Elena turned. Chen was upright, one hand steadying himself against the metal rail of the gurney. His daughter had her head down, didn't see him move. His parents were speaking quietly in Cantonese, something about hospital food, not watching their son attempt to stand. His body was asking for something his mouth couldn't articulate. The bathroom. Basic dignity. 3 days in a hospital gown without the ability to ask for help was a particular kind of torture. Elena moved without decision, the way someone picks up an object that's falling. She was 10 feet away. She saw his mouth form the shape of a word his vocal cords couldn't produce. She saw him take 1 step into the hallway. Then the 2nd step. Then the 3rd. And then his knees buckled. The collapse didn't make noise the way people thought collapses did. There was no dramatic fall. There was just a geometric failure. A body folding in on itself like a chair collapsing inward. His lips were already turning the shade of a bruise that hadn't finished blooming. The color was what stopped everything. That particular blue. Elena had seen it before. She had seen it in Helmand when a Marine took a bullet through the right lung and the air escaped into the space it wasn't supposed to be. She had seen it in her dreams. Chen's daughter screamed. Elena was moving before thought could catch up, her body running on 2 decades of muscle memory and the kind of knowledge that didn't need language to exist. She could see it now, the neck veins distended like cords about to snap, the trachea visibly shifted to the left, the chest wall not rising on the right side, the O2 sat probably already in the 60s. Tension pneumothorax. Air in the pleural space, pressure building, collapsing the lung, pushing the heart against the opposite side of the chest. 8 minutes without intervention and the heart stops. Chen probably had 4. Dr. Sterling's voice cut through the rising panic like a scalpel. Someone get me respiratory therapy. Portable chest X-ray to Trauma Bay 3. Page radiology. I am ordering you to step back, Martinez. We follow protocol here. Do not touch that patient. The words were careful. Precise. Sterling had positioned himself so the other nurses could hear. So the medical students could hear. So the documentation would be clear. He was establishing a record. Any action Elena took outside of physician authorization would be on her. Scope of practice violation. Criminal negligence. License revocation. Elena felt the weight of 24 hours of refusals bearing down. 20 doctors who had turned away. 20 reasons given. 20 justifications offered. And now one more moment where the system demanded patience in the face of someone dying. She knelt beside Chen's collapsing body. The air left the room the way it does before a lightning strike. Everything went still. Sterling's face went the color of old ivory. The other nurses froze. The attending physician, 2 bays overturned, mouth opening, but didn't move. It was the kind of stillness where you could hear the ventilators breathing for their patients, the monitor beeps, the fluorescent lights buzzing their electric hymn above them all. Elena's hands were already moving. She grabbed the supply cart. 14-gauge needle. Betadine swab in the other hand. She found the landmarks on Chen's chest, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, where the air was trapped and the pressure was building. Her fingers read the anatomy like Braille. The muscle memory of 200 combat saves moved through her without consultation. In Helmand Province, in a forward operating base with no physician present, with a Marine bleeding out from a collapsed lung, this was the only choice between dying now and possibly dying later. This was triage. This was the mathematics of survival. Sterling's voice, "Martinez, I am ordering you to step back." Elena didn't respond. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping was the most beautiful sound she had heard in 47 hours. Oxygen saturation climbed. 75. 82. 88. Stable. Marcus Chen's eyes fluttered open, his pupils tracking Elena's face for the first time in 47 hours. His daughter had been standing 3 feet away when his chest wall collapsed, and now she was screaming in ASL, her hands moving so fast they blurred, relief and terror and gratitude all at once. Elena's hands were steady. They always were. The needle had gone in clean between the second and third ribs, and the subcutaneous air that had been crushing his left lung against his heart for nearly 2 days had rushed out in a sound like a tire deflating, like relief itself had a voice. His breathing deepened. Color crept back into his lips. The ER staff, which had been standing frozen in that particular paralysis that came from watching someone outside the system receive emergency care, suddenly remembered they had jobs. A respiratory tech moved to get oxygen. A nurse adjusted the cardiac monitor. Chen's parents clutched each other, their faces wet. Dr. Sterling watched the entire resuscitation from 6 feet away. His expression moved through shock, then fury, then something worse, calculation. He didn't check on Chen. He didn't verify the airway. He didn't acknowledge Elena's intervention had just saved a man's life. He turned and walked directly toward the administrative corridor, phone already in his hand, dialing before he'd cleared the trauma bay doors. Elena was still bent over the stretcher, making sure the needle placement was holding, her muscle memory from 200 combat saves in Helmand Province guiding every movement with the kind of precision that couldn't be faked or taught. She'd trained in field hospitals that ran on generators and prayer. She'd held open chests in blackout conditions. She'd made decisions in 30 seconds that most surgeons would need a conference for. Attention pneumothorax was a problem she could solve with her eyes closed. What she couldn't solve was the phone call Sterling was making. CFO on line 2, Sterling said, his voice carrying a strange artificial calm that made the hairs on Elena's neck rise. Yes, I'm calling to report a significant scope of practice violation. My attending nurse just performed an invasive procedure without physician authorization. A needle decompression. Completely unsupervised. No orders. Yes, I have 3 witnesses. He paused, listening. Absolutely. Immediate termination is appropriate. She's a patient safety risk. Elena's jaw tightened. Not because she was afraid. She'd been in worse situations than a hospital administrator's vindictive phone call. She'd survived places where worse meant being shot at while holding someone's spinal cord together. But she recognized what was happening. Sterling wasn't reporting a safety concern. He was eliminating a witness. She'd mentioned Helmand Province in the break room, and that single word had become a threat to everything he'd built. because anyone who investigated Elena Martinez's past would find inconsistencies. Missing years. Unexplained credentials. And from there, it wouldn't take much to uncover that Dr. Sterling's brother owned a medical equipment company that had billed Mercy General for over $2.4 million in supplies in the past 18 months. That Sterling controlled which patients received which equipment. That Sterling had created a financial incentive to treat insured patients and refuse everyone else. Elena was a loose thread. He was pulling her out before she unraveled him. Security arrived at 1847 hours. Elena was charting Chen's vitals when a supervisor she didn't recognize appeared at the medication station with 2 security officers flanking her, the kind of flank that made it clear this wasn't a conversation. The supervisor was reading from a printed statement, her voice professional and distant, the way people sound when they've been instructed not to make eye contact. Elena Martinez, you're being placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. Your access badge is revoked effective now. You'll be escorted to your locker to collect personal items. The security officers stood with their hands resting on their belts, not aggressive, just present. Just there to make sure she left. One of them looked about 40, had the bearing of someone who'd spent time in uniform, and his eyes held something like apology. Elena nodded once. No tremor in her hands. No color rising in her face. She'd been preparing for this since the moment Sterling heard her say Helmand. She'd been preparing for something like this her entire life. She stood, removed her badge from her pocket, and handed it to the supervisor. The charge is false. I acted under medical necessity. The patient would have died without intervention. Her voice was level, the way a hammer was level, flat and true and incapable of bending. I understand. The supervisor took the badge, looking genuinely uncomfortable. The consultant's preliminary audit flagged concerns about your patient advocacy in uninsured cases. Combined with this violation, human resources will need to schedule an exit interview within. Elena was already moving toward the locker room. She knew how this played. She'd seen it before, not in hospitals but in military contexts where officers wanted you gone and had lawyers on speed dial. The narrative was already written. The investigation would be thorough and predetermined. By tomorrow morning, references from her previous facility would mysteriously report concerns. Background checks would flag gaps that weren't actually gaps. The system would move against her with the efficiency of something that had been designed for exactly this purpose. Her locker was at the end of the row, standard-issue hospital grey. Inside was the detritus of 3 years of quiet work, 2 pairs of compression socks, an ancient stethoscope with fraying tubing, a water bottle with the hospital logo faded almost invisible. There was a cracked mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" that Miguel had given her 2 years ago. There was a dying succulent she'd been keeping on the windowsill, brown at the edges, refusing to surrender despite her neglect. There was a photo of Sarah in desert camis, taken 2 weeks before the IED, her arm around Elena's shoulders, both of them grinning at the camera with the particular wildness that came from knowing you might not be alive next month. Elena pulled out a cardboard box from under the bench. Boxes were never hard to find in a hospital, and placed each item inside with the care of someone packing a shrine. The security officer with the military bearing watched from a distance. "For what it's worth," he said quietly, "that was good work. With the patient. That was solid work." Elena didn't look at him. "Thank you." She sealed the box with her hands, pressed the flaps down, and picked it up. It was lighter than it should have been, which meant she carried very little of herself into the world anymore. Everything important was either buried or burned. The walk to the employee exit took 45 seconds. The San Diego evening had turned gray, the kind of gray that came before rain, the air pressure dropping like a hand pressing down on the back of her neck. By the time she reached the parking lot, drops were falling, sparse at first, then deliberate, then insistent. She stood at the bus stop on Mercy Boulevard with the cardboard box growing damp on her lap, watching the photo of Sarah through the plastic sleeve as rainwater began to bead on the cellophane. She didn't cry. Her training had burned that out of her, or maybe something deeper had, something that came from living so long behind a mask that crying would have felt like admitting the mask wasn't permanent. But she did think, sitting on that wet bench with rain soaking through her scrubs, that Sarah had died in that valley so people like Marcus Chen could live. That Elena had spent 12 years learning to save lives in places designed to end them. That she'd come to San Diego to disappear, to become someone small enough to fit into the margins of a civilian life. And that even here, even in scrubs instead of tactical gear, even pushing medications instead of pushing people through the chaos of active fire, the world had still found her. The system had still recognized her as a threat. Because the same hands that could hold a collapsed lung together, the same mind that could make life or death decisions in the dark, didn't fit quietly into anyone's filing cabinet. At Mercy General, Dr. Sterling sat across from his brother in an upscale restaurant in La Jolla, their table overlooking the Pacific. The ocean was the color of steel in the failing light. Sterling's second scotch was 3/4 empty. "It's handled," he was saying, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a man who'd just eliminated a problem. "The CFO has terminated her. 3 weeks of investigation will find documented violations. References will support her instability. By the time she thinks about fighting this, it'll be too late." His brother was already calculating, thinking about next quarter's billing, thinking about the new equipment contracts they could push through now that the risk was gone. They didn't know that in the emergency department of Mercy General, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, stabilized and finally admitted after 48 hours of refusal from 20 different attending physicians, was asking his daughter in ASL where the nurse went. The one who'd saved his life. The one who'd broken the rules to keep him alive. No one had an answer for him. Elena stood at the bus stop in the rain with a cardboard box balanced on her lap, the kind of box that carries the sum total of 12 years compressed into 4 cubic feet. A cracked mug reading World's Okayest Nurse sat wedged between her trauma shears and a dying succulent, its leaves the color of old pennies. The photo of Sarah lay on top, her best friend's face frozen at 26, grinning in front of a compound wall somewhere in Helmand Province that neither of them ever spoke about anymore because Sarah hadn't made it out. Elena stared at the photo as rain drummed against the cardboard, the water beginning to seep through the bottom seams, threatening everything inside. She didn't move. The bus was coming, headlights cutting through the grey afternoon like searchlights across dark water, but Elena sat motionless, watching Sarah's face blur under the falling water, thinking about the 20 doctors who'd walked past Marcus Chen's stretcher without stopping, each one following Sterling's lead like lemmings toward a cliff they didn't even know existed. What she didn't know was that while she sat in the rain 3 miles away, the FBI was walking through the hospital's doors. They'd been quiet about it, 6 months of investigation, surveillance footage reviewed at 0.5x speed, financial transactions mapped like a spider's web connecting Sterling to his brother, to medical equipment vendors, to inflated billing codes that had generated $1.2 million in fraudulent kickbacks. The agents moved with the kind of precision that comes from knowing exactly what they'll find before they start looking. Senior Special Agent Reeves carried a sealed warrant with Sterling's name printed across the top, his Italian leather shoes silent against the linoleum he'd thought he owned. They found him in his office, reviewing patient charts with the kind of casual arrogance that comes from believing you're untouchable, that your network runs deep enough, that your brother's political connections matter more than electronic records don't lie. They handcuffed him at 0915. The perp walk happened at 0947, precisely when the morning shift change was creating maximum visibility. 2 agents gripped Sterling's biceps, his hands locked behind his back, his face the color of hospital walls, that blank institutional white that suggests all the blood has drained somewhere nobody wants to follow. His Italian shoes scuffed against the linoleum with each step, the leather creasing in ways expensive shoes aren't designed to crease, the sound carrying through the emergency department like a siren nobody could ignore. The nurses at the station looked up from their computers, from their charts, from the rituals of their ordinary morning, and watched in the kind of stunned silence that only comes when the world inverts itself in real time. The unit board still had Elena's write-up posted, the formal accusation of insubordination, Sterling's signature slashed across the bottom in blue ink like a cobra marking territory. One of the FBI agents tore it down without breaking stride, the paper making a sound like fabric ripping as he crumpled it and dropped it in a biohazard bin. Sterling's eyes locked forward, refusing to meet anyone's gaze, but his jaw was moving, grinding, the kind of involuntary muscle contraction that happens when the mind is processing information it refuses to accept. What the nurses didn't know was what the agents already knew. Sterling's phone, seized as evidence, contained text chains with his brother spanning 18 months. Direct quotations. Specific numbers. Discussions of equipment costs inflated by 47%, negotiations with 12 vendors to steer insured patients toward high billing procedures while optimizing referral patterns, Sterling's phrase, for uninsured cases. The texts were explicit: tell the docs that non-revenue beds affect their bonus structure. 20 physicians received that message, each one receiving veiled threats about referral networks, hospital privileges, the kind of professional pressure that looks invisible but carries the weight of a loaded gun. The FBI forensic accountant had documented every transaction. $1.2 million in 18 months. A brother in county holding. A former medical consultant in San Jose who admitted Sterling paid him $8,000 to audit Elena's patient files specifically, not to conduct legitimate quality review but to excavate anything, medication discrepancies, charting errors, anything that could be weaponized against a nurse who'd seen too much and said something about Helmand Province at exactly the wrong moment. Springfield General called Mercy's board within hours. No, they'd never received any reference check from Sterling. No, they didn't know what he was talking about. Elena Martinez left their facility in good standing, the kind of employee that hospitals compete to keep, and if Sterling had fabricated an entire narrative of concern that raised considerably more questions than answers. The outside consultant admitted everything under promise of immunity: Sterling's money, Sterling's specific instructions to target this nurse, Sterling's request that the audit focus exclusively on her charts and her medication administration records, Sterling's voice on the phone saying, "Find me something or don't bother billing me." The FBI cybercrime unit had caught the intrusion in real time. Sterling attempting to access Elena's military service records through a Veterans Affairs database using fraudulent credentials, trying to find something, anything, that might discredit her testimony before she realized his billing was hemorrhaging money. The attempt was logged, time-stamped, documented. It was the moment he stopped being an arrogant doctor and became a federal criminal. His attorney was negotiating in a county holding cell, a holding cell that smelled like bleach and desperation, the kind of room where people finally understand that connections don't matter when the evidence is this clear. News cameras gathered outside Mercy General, their satellites pointing skyward like mechanical vultures. The hospital board held a press conference at 1400 hours, Dr. Patel's voice steady and formal, the kind of official apology that comes too late but must come anyway. "We were deceived by Dr. Sterling's fraudulent conduct. We have failed Senior Chief Petty Officer Martinez, and we are implementing immediate reforms to ensure this never occurs again." Senior Chief Petty Officer. The words hung in the air like confession. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen watched from his hospital bed, the tension pneumothorax resolved, his lungs expanded, his daughter translating the news broadcast into sign language with the kind of precision that only comes from love. He signed 3 words: "Where is she?" Miguel provided his mother's address. Chen's daughter made a call that changed everything that followed. 2 years passed like water through open fingers. Elena Martinez walked through the halls of Mercy General's new veteran care wing, her white coat embroidered with the insignia of a senior chief petty officer, her title beneath it reading Director of Veteran Medical Services. The wing treated every veteran regardless of insurance status, a policy funded by grants Elena had secured from the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Department of Defense, money that flowed from people who understood what sacrifice actually looked like. Sergeant Chen's unit patch hung framed on her desk, the 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, Dark Horse, positioned next to Sarah's photograph, both visible now, no longer hidden beneath layers of secrecy and shame. The cracked World's Okayest nurse mug sat on her desk beside a photograph of Miguel in his marine dress blues, the succulent from that cardboard box thriving in the window, its leaves a vibrant green that suggested resurrection was possible if you had enough light and patience. Lieutenant Commander Webb, the SEAL team leader who'd testified, stopped by monthly to guest lecture her veteran care protocols, which were now standard across naval medical facilities from San Diego to Norfolk. The 4 nurses who'd left the break room that day, the ones who'd gathered their lunches in silence, choosing institutional loyalty over human decency, had each apologized privately. Elena had accepted, and then hired 2 of them for the new wing because she understood that people could change if given the chance. The hospital board commissioned a plaque in the lobby, Senior Chief Petty Officer Elena Martinez, in recognition of courage, compassion, and service above self. Elena never looked at it when she walked past. She was reviewing morning intakes when a young Marine arrived, deaf, charity care status, rejected by 3 outside facilities that Sterling's legacy continued to haunt. Elena read the chart and recognized the architecture of the problem, the same refusals, the same communication barrier language, the same institutional indifference. She made 2 calls, one to radiology and one to the ICU, and the Marine was admitted within an hour. As she signed his admission orders, her hands moving with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned this language to communicate with her best friend in a combat zone, she thought about the words she'd told the empty break room 2 years ago, the ones that started everything spiraling outward like shrapnel. The Marine's mother asked, "Why are you helping us when no one else would?" Elena looked at Sarah's photograph, at Chen's unit patch, at the life she'd finally built by letting herself be seen, by refusing to remain invisible. "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the kind of weight that comes from having survived things most people can't imagine. "Sometimes the battlefield is right here, and the enemy is indifference." She signed the order, handed it to the ward clerk, and returned to the work of saving lives, the way she always had, one at a time, with quiet dignity, her hidden life no longer a burden but the foundation of everything she'd become. If you found yourself saying yes when 20 others said no, if you found yourself reaching for the needle when protocol demanded hesitation, if you found yourself finally speaking the truth you'd buried for 12 years, that was when you discovered that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding it all together. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes nobody sees until it's too late. Like and comment if you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your true value.